Hi, it's Jason from Fraser Valley Rose Farm. Well, I can hear the birds sing, the buds are swelling on my roses. It is the time, at least in my climate, to start considering spring rose pruning, so that makes it an excellent time for us to review the rules together. And I'm talking rules of thumb, guidelines passed down from one generation of gardener to the next. And a video like this is perfect for that critical conversation about whether those rules make sense, what rules should you be following, what guidelines really are based on horticulture and science rather than just old gardener's tales, let's say. So let's go through them one by one. I have 7 rules to go through here, so let's get to them quickly. Rule number 1, and the most common guidance you'll get on the timing of when to prune your roses, is tied to this shrub here. That's the forsythia, and when it puts out its bright yellow blooms. Now mine hasn't quite done it yet. It's stubbornly holding off even though the roses are ready in the landscape. So I will say it's not a perfect sign, but it is a very visual sign, and that's why people point to it most often, is that when your whole landscape begins to wake up, you start to see blooms on the Saskatoon or the red flowering currant or the Japanese quince, daffodils, on hellebores. All of these flowers are signs that your landscape is starting to warm up, wake up, and the sap is running, and it's a good time to address those repeat flowering roses that benefit from an early prune like this. Now, I will say that this rule of thumb has some exceptions, and one of those is that not all roses are repeat flowering. So if you have old garden roses of Europe, the Gallicas, the Damasks, if you have garden shrubs that bloom only once, ramblers that bloom only once, they're waiting to bloom on old wood. So pruning them right now would just cost you blooming. So you want to wait for those ones to bloom, to prune them after they're done with their bloom period. This timing with the forsythia doesn't work for everybody. If you were in some place like California or Florida or India, for instance, you have much milder seasons than we do, and you should be timing it in the coolest part of the year. In those places, probably December. In Australia, it might be June. But in any case, timing it with the forsythia won't be as meaningful for those in milder climates. The other thing I would say is if you're a person in my kind of climate and you missed this timing, you didn't get it first thing in the spring, just wait. You can just wait until your roses bloom their first time in the season and then tackle your pruning then, both for the repeat bloomers and for the one-time bloomers. It's just fine. The repeat bloomers will in fact put on new wood and bloom later in the year. Rule number 2, I'll put it up on the screen right now, is to reduce every rose down to 3 to 5 strong canes every year and reduce the height down to 18 inches. Now this is a rule that comes with some numbers, which is kind of nice because people are looking for actual guidance, and 18 inches on this rose, that seems pretty reasonable. In fact, this rose fits the rule relatively well, but what you want to do with every rose in your garden may be a little bit different. This one is a hybrid tea rose named Olympiad, so getting it down to a small number of strong canes every year and bringing down the height to 18 inches kind of fits it. There are a bunch of roses out there where this rule doesn't fit well, and I'll show you those in just a moment. But since I have my hands on this rose, I'm going to go ahead and show you what that rule would look like in action. And here I am, I'm just taking them down to height, choosing strong canes, getting them down to about 18 inches. The rule said something like 3 to 5 canes, so you're trying to reduce the number of canes. I'm not sure, that seems a little arbitrary to me. And that's pretty close. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 is as slow as I'm going to go on this one here. Maybe I could just reduce this one down here, and that gets us into the range of following that rule. Rule number 3 is to focus your efforts on dead, diseased, damaged, crossing, and weak spindly stems. So I'll go through those very quickly, each on their own, but first one is dead, and you can see that this stem here, dark black. That's what the winter did to it, and this is in fact why rule number 1 makes some sense, to wait for the forsythia to bloom, wait for the landscape to come to life, and then see what kind of dead stems there are on your roses. If you've had a harsh winter like we did here, you may have significant black stems to remove, so if you did a fall pruning, well, you'll end up doing the pruning again at this time of year. When I say a dead stem, that black one is a good example, but when I say diseased, it's my way to give you an excuse to get rid of the ones that don't look so good. Like on the left here, in comparison to a green stem, you see one that has sort of a black smut on the outside of it, turns gray as it goes further up, the extremities look kind of lifeless. That's something that you would definitely remove, the one on the left, in comparison to the healthy green stem on the right. That's what I mean by diseased. Damaged is kind of self-explanatory. Stems that were broken off or broken apart or hanging loose because of wind over the winter, those ones should be removed right now. And let's use this to say the crossing and weak spindly growth, and you can see in the center of the shrub there that there's a whole bunch of tiny little thin canes that are crossing each other over, rubbing against each other over in the winter wind, getting damaged, and there's weak spindly growth congesting the center of the shrub. So if all you ever did is focus your pruning efforts on removing dead, diseased, damaged crossing and weak spindly growth, your roses would by default just be better for your efforts. Rule number 4 is to prune to an outward facing bud. Look at the little red parts on this that will form the new stems and shoots and flowers. That's the part they're talking about when they say an outward facing bud. And by outward facing, they mean not growing towards the center of the shrub, but growing outwards. Now, the reason for this rule, I think I understand, but it's kind of nonsense. And I'll give you a close-up look at the stems on this to show you why I think it doesn't work, is that your rose is going to grow not just from the top bud, not just from the one you select, but from multiple places all the way up and down this stem. So the idea that you can control the growth to move outwards by selecting where to make that cut is actually kind of nonsense. And the problem, and the reason I address it at all, is it gets new rose gardeners and new people to rose pruning all hyper-focused on choosing a bud that faces outwards when it actually doesn't make any big difference to the growth of the rose itself. So it hyper-focuses them on an unnecessary detail. So don't worry about whether it faces inwards, whether it faces outwards. Rather, focus your attention on the size, shape, and health of the shrub. You'll do a lot better without worrying about the fussiness of picking an inward or outward facing bud. Rule number 5, and it's a good idea when you do pruning of any sort, is to start with clean, sharp blades. Your choice of pruning blades for a rose is either going to be hand pruners like this. A bypass pruner is great for it, or for larger stems it might be a lopper like this. Either way, you may want to start with just a couple of passes with a carbide sharpener along the blade just to make sure you have a clean edge and that you're not leaving behind any broken stems or skins of the stems that may cause an infection afterwards. Now clean, you use something like a disinfecting wipe like this is perfect for it. You can also use spray-on Lysol or something like that. Totally fine to use household disinfectants on this. The only thing I wouldn't recommend necessarily is using something like bleach, which can corrode the blades. So spray-on Lysol or disinfecting wipes like these are a pretty good start. What are you trying to avoid? You're trying to avoid passing bacteria, fungus, any kind of disease from one rose to the next or from your tools between roses. I know that you can't necessarily spread, say, rose mosaic virus, but you still could have unknowingly something like agrobacterium or crown gall in your garden, and you just want to reduce the risks of spreading that around from rose to rose. Rule number 6 is to cut on an angle or a slant rather than straight across. So if you were looking at a cut on this stem here, instead of going straight across like this, oftentimes they'll say you'll want to go up on a 45-degree angle or a 33-degree angle or something equally specific. The idea behind this, well, I'm not exactly sure, seems to be a tradition. I guess one of the ideas is that if you cut it at a slant like this, an angle, that when the rain hits this spot, that the rain could slope off or drip off easier. Now, of course, I live in a climate with plenty of rainfall, and I've never seen that make a difference in the results on a stem. I've never seen it speed up the drying or allow water to run off better, and I don't see rot on ones that are cut straight across like this either. So I guess my point on this, and I wouldn't mention it, except that what it does do is it adds complexity to the instructions of how to prune something. If you're having to fuss over placing a 45 or a 33 or some slanted angle out to some outward facing bud, what it does is it will slow down people who are trying to learn how to prune roses. A straight across cut, or whatever is the natural angle of your hand, will be just fine. On a related note, you may also hear that people go around and they seal these cuts with glue or with nail polish or a pruning sealer to try to keep out cane boring insects. Now, the thing about cane boring insects is that the most damaging of those, say the raspberry or redneck cane borer, do not enter through the cut stems of your roses, the ones that drill down and go down to the base of your rose and cause major damage. The ones that you sometimes see opportunistically attacking the ends of these stems really aren't flying about much at this time of year anyway if you're doing this in late winter or spring. So the value of pruning those or sealing those pruning cuts is quite questionable, and it certainly will not protect you against the most damaging of the cane borers. So it's something I don't recommend, and I don't think there's a lot of backing for it. Rule number 7 is to prune to an open-centered shrub. Now, at the same time, you're going to be pruning for size and shape, but as I mentioned before, size and shape is really quite a personal thing. You decide what is a pleasing size and shape. On a hybrid tea rose, it might be a little bit more like the 18 inches that we discussed on Olympiad. On something like this, I wouldn't mind leaving a little more height. I'm going to let this one go up to about 2.5 feet of height because I want a more impressive shrub, and my experience with this plant has told me that that is where it performs its best. So what I'm going to do is, towards that rule of pruning to an open center, is I'm going to remove anything in the center of this shrub here that is getting in the way of air circulation and interfering, so that this stem has a little bit of room and this stem has a little bit of room, but this big black one back here, or let's say dark brown one, is kind of congesting up the center of the shrub. So I'm going to remove that, and I'll remove it down lower as well. So I'm going to keep on working away at this one here. I don't know if I'll voice over the whole thing, but I will show you the whole process so you can see that really the goals are very much the same. I'm trying to remove the dead, diseased, damaged and crossing stems. I'm getting rid of the ones that are in towards the center, so I'm pruning to an open center, and at the same time I'm choosing a height and shape that I prefer for this rose. Here's the final result on the rose. You can see that I've definitely reduced the number of stems, thinned it out quite well. I've taken out the dead, diseased, damaged, and crossing stems, but this is much higher than that Olympiad shrub I showed you earlier, up to about 24 to maybe 30 inches in height. And I definitely have not paid much attention to whether I'm pruning to an inward or outward facing bud. Those cuts are not particular in their angle, and I definitely haven't sealed anything. I made a quick job of this. Probably took me under 5 minutes for the whole shrub, and now I can move on to more roses. This one here, Westerland, naturally a climber that I tend to keep as a shrub. I usually like to leave 3 or 4 feet on this shrub because I like it to be a big, impressive shrub through the season. So again, I'm choosing a different height, but I'm doing the exact same process. And there you have it, twice the height probably, but still the exact same process. Dead, diseased, damaged, crossing stems are out. I've thinned it out, made a pleasing size and shape to my own subjective preferences. So I've pruned for size, shape, and health, and those are the basics. All the other stuff, all the fussy things about cutting angles and outward facing buds, you can forget all that and just focus on the basics: size, shape, and health. The other things you can do at this time of year, and I'll just throw them here at the back end, is clean out any leaves. No leaves hanging on this right now, but any leaves that have dropped at the ground, clean that out as well. Maybe replace the mulch, put on some fertilizer for the season. In my case, I usually go with a ½ cup of alfalfa just to boost up the nitrogen levels as they come into the season, and that's all I do, and should give them a good start going into the season. If you have any questions, please drop those down below the video and I'll see what I can do to help.